Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, June 20th, 1986, news reports are starting to emerge about the death of basketball player Len Bias. The night before, Bias had died of a cocaine overdose. This was just a few days after he'd been drafted by the Boston Celtics and was poised to become an NBA star, maybe even a main rival to Michael Jordan. Why is this a political story and not just a sports story? Well, because Len Bias's death happened right in the middle of a moral and political panic about cocaine and crack in this country, and by the end of the summer, Congress had passed sweeping anti-drug legislation that, in effect, gave birth, in many ways, to the modern prison industrial complex and all sorts of punitive drug laws. So here to discuss Bias's death and the political ripple effects still being felt to this day are, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is the director and producer Adam McKay. I've mentioned a few times on this show that I worked with Adam on this series called Death at the Wing, which looks at the intersection of basketball and politics in the 80s. And we did an episode on Len Bias. We've been waiting for this news hook, this date hook to have Adam on. But Adam McKay, a founding member of UCB and a director of Anchorman and Step Brothers and a producer on Succession, director of The Big Short. I could go on and on and on. Welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here. Well, I mean, under this tragic anniversary, I wouldn't quite say a pleasure, but...
Yeah, indeed. So, Adam, I'm curious, you might be shocked to hear that the audience for a podcast called This Day in Esoteric Political History is not the most sports-savvy crowd. So can you give us a sense of how big of a deal Len Bias was, sports-wise? And then we'll get into the political ramifications. But, I mean, he really is one of the great what-ifs in sports history, right?
No question about it. As a kid, I lived in Worcester, Massachusetts up until about 4th grade, and that carried over to me being a Celtics fan into college, and then eventually I stopped being a fan of any team, and I'm just a fan of basketball now. But I was a freshman in college, and I woke up, and I heard this story, and I had like one of those starter jackets of the Celtics. I was hardcore Celtics fan, and I heard this story, and I didn't sob, but I teared up, and for like 3 days was in a fog, a depressed fog. And as a Celtics fan, it wasn't just for a Celtics fan, it was the entire basketball world. It was the story. It's hard to describe what a talent, what an amazing player Len Bias was. Like, just to say it, there's a lot, by the time you get to the NBA, everyone's really good. This guy was a notch above a notch good. He was in that zone of Jordan, and what he meant for the Celtics too. The Celtics were an aging, battered team at that time. It was 1986, and he was their entire future. So it was titanic. It was the news story. ESPN was still relatively new at that point. Everyone was talking about it. It was covered everywhere.
I think it's worth sitting with that personal tragedy for a moment before we get into the politics of it all, because here was this young man who had just been drafted into the NBA. He was finally going to be able to build a career and a life and generational wealth in this new role. And just a few days later, he died in this tragedy. And it really is a heartbreaking story just on a personal level, and in addition to everything else.
The other thing that's lost a little bit with it is now we're used to hearing stories, especially after the opioid epidemic, about people dying from drugs. It's actually fairly common. 500,000 people by some estimates since the Sackler family unleashed opioids onto our country. So now we're kind of used to it. At that time, it wasn't that common. You had John Belushi was the big one that we had heard, who had died from cocaine and heroin a few years before that. And so this was kind of a new thing. When we heard that he had died from cocaine, it hit all of us a little strange. I grew up in a relatively working class community, so none of us could ever afford cocaine. We were pretty much kegs of beer and maybe a little bit of marijuana. So we had no encounters with cocaine at that time. And it was really, that was a big part of it as well, was the tragedy, the real sadness for this family. And by all accounts, not that it would make a huge difference, but by all accounts, Len Bias is just a wonderful guy, beloved by his teammates, a shining light out of the University of Maryland. So yeah, you had like triple tragedy and shock going on here. You had a wounded family. You had a whole community that had placed their hopes on him, not to mention a massive national and at that point burgeoning international fan base that was crushed by this. Yeah, it was really, I can't overstate what a huge shock and tragedy it was.
I mean, I think so much about the aftermath of the death as well, because when we think about the conflation between cocaine and crack and this being, you know, a huge moment in what explodes in the crack era, and him being pinned to that and the racial dynamics of this, like the aftermath of his death also, I think, robs him of a lot as well, because he gets completely stigmatized in a way that all of that, you know, hero worship comes down to like this, he did drugs, you know, all of a sudden everyone becomes unworthy when they're addicted to drugs and, you know, out of control.
Yeah. And, you know, it's worth clarifying that as far as we know, Len Bias took regular old cocaine, which, you know, as Adam was sort of saying, was sort of through the 70s, at least a party drug for relatively rich white people. And the way that this story metastasizes into this idea that, oh, here's this young black man and he did crack, which were the rumors that came out. I mean, Adam, can you talk about why this tragedy and the rumors around it sort of perfectly just zipped into this growing tidal wave of a moral and political panic around crack cocaine?
Yeah, and I could speak to it from two perspectives. One is the perspective I had when I lived through the event, seeing it from a distance, from very, very far away. And then the other one is what we now know after working with Jody on Death at the Wing. And in the moment, crack was this exotic, strange, scary, far-off danger to a lot of people. And at the same time, we're living through a time in the country where our political winds are changing in a drastic way, where America is swinging hard to the right wing as a reaction to the reforms of the 60s into the 70s. And what you have is Kellie's 100% right. It's a tragic collision, because you have a lot of politicians. And by the way, I include the Democrats in this, because the whole country was swinging to the right. And Tip O'Neill was a big driver of the criminal justice bill that came as a result of Len Bias' death. So this isn't just Republicans. And what do you do if you're a politician who just cares about your career and wants to, you know, siphon off votes? You look for scapegoats. And what better scapegoat situation is there than an aggrieved sports fan base mixed with drugs, mixed with race? And that's what you see, is this just absolutely horrific collision between all of these forces. You
know, we talked about this in the last episode we did about Mandela's visit to Boston in just a few years later, 1990. But it is worth saying that the Boston-ness of this story is really important too, because it is the center of the political universe, certainly for Democrats at this point, including Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, is a huge Celtics fan. There are reports that he actually wanted to meet with Len Bias after Len Bias got drafted. So it's not a coincidence, and it's a huge factor here that this does center in Boston.
Boston's known as kind of the white team at this point. So there's a big racial undertone with this. They've drafted their first big African-American player, and then you mix in the crack, you mix in the fear-mongering, and Tip O'Neill jumps all over it. The Republicans jump all over it. And then this nasty rumor starts that he was smoking crack, Len Bias, and he was not, but it didn't matter at that point. Then the media jumped in, and by then the media had become deregulated and really was about ratings over news. The news in the 70s used to be about esteem and awards and breaking scoops. And at this point now, it's about ratings.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, you have CNN as a 24-hour news network. And so you can have this kind of round-the-clock coverage that can take advantage of all of the incendiary parts of this story. And there were plenty of incendiary things to point to, especially once the media started viewing this through the lens of race and transforming cocaine into crack. It just has such devastating consequences.
When you think about the difference between crack and cocaine, the only difference is water and heat. Like they're not too drastically different chemicals at play here. But I mean, it's highly racialized. So when they introduce this legislation that's meant to crack down on drugs, there's a couple things at play. One is that the penalty for the amount of crack that you can have on you versus cocaine is like 100 to 1. I mean, those consequences are devastating, which explode the prison industrial complex. But also that Democrats are a big part of this. Black political figures are a big part of this. I think of the book Locking Up Our Own, which also plays into this part where there wasn't any room to say, but this is a public health crisis. There wasn't any room to sort of look at this with the lens that we look at opioids today. It was just drugs are bad. If you do them, you're bad. If you're black, you're really bad. You know, like you're a criminal and you don't deserve to exist in this world.
I mean, we played audio in this episode of Death at the Wing of Democratic senators trying to like one-up each other in terms of the punitive and sort of draconian language that they're using. So you have, I think it's Tip O'Neill who basically says, if it was up to me, I'd take all the crack users and put them on an island and throw away the key, you know, which is kind of what we did with Rikers Island, I suppose. Yeah, it's this fever of punitiveness, which, Adam, is very different. This is another thing I kind of learned as we were doing our reporting. It's actually kind of different from the just say no approach, which is like on an individual and sort of says like, well, it's up to you. You should say no and walk away. Here, it's the state really coming in and saying, you know what? No, we're going to punish in a massive
no
way.
or else, pretty much.
Yeah, right.
There was a character that was created around that time that I remember hearing about as a kid, and it was the pusher man. And it was the guy who would lurk around the schoolyards and offer you drugs. And I never saw a pusher man growing up. And by the way, the idea of little kids doing like crack, I never heard about that. I mean, there were kids who had their life ruined by crack. There were parents that maybe had crack, but like there was this really scary character. And you had these actors like Charles Bronson and Clint Eastwood that were just like, eat lead, scumbag. And they were going to take out the pusher man. And it became this whole mythology of these scary characters that in reality were, the whole drug thing was more related to cutting funding in inner city neighborhoods and trauma and people trying to treat PTSD, through self-medication. I mean, the real causes are much sadder and more complicated, as they always are.
Well, there was this real moral panic around drugs. I just remember growing up in the 1980s, that exact thing, right? You were told as a kid over and over that somebody was going to try to sell you drugs or try to slip you drugs, right? Never take candy from strangers because they could be laced with drugs because they're trying to get you hooked so that you ruin your life and that you're stuck in this cycle. And it's just not how anything works. But I think that it affected an entire generation.
This is a much lighter example of this, but I saw someone the other day remark that as a kid growing up in the 80s, they were consumed with this fear that they would get lost in the Bermuda Triangle for some reason. Like the Bermuda Triangle was like I'd just be walking down the street to school and all of a sudden I'd be in the Bermuda Triangle, or the other one is quicksand. Like quicksand was like a genuine fear for people growing up in the 80s. Not to make light of this, but
I was in college, so it's my sophomore year in college. I transferred to Temple University in Philly. And it's when the stand-up boom hits. So we're all doing stand-up on the weekends, my friends and I. And I decided I'm going to smoke some pot because I've heard about all these old comics like Carlin and Pryor and stuff who smoke pot. So I'm like, I'm in Philly. So I go walking around the streets and I sprained my ankle playing basketball. And so I was kind of have a little bit of a limp. And I can't find any drugs. I'm like in a rough neighborhood in Philly and I'm just going around like walking past people waiting for someone to say it. I'm saying to people,
where's the pusher man?
You're like, Nancy Reagan told me someone would approach me and offer me crack.
And finally a guy's like, yeah, man, I got that herb. I go up to him and I'm like, I'm broke, by the way, but I'm like, I have like a crumpled up $5 bill. And he just hands me a bag. And then he like runs 5 steps away from me. And I look at the bag and it's a bag of dirt. And the guy is read that I have a sprained ankle, and then he just laughs at me and strolls away. And I was like, well played.
Look, we should start to wrap up here, and I do want to come a little, back to this Len Bias story and the ripple effect. So as we've said, the actual law that gets written, this omnibus drug bill that has these mandatory minimum sentences, this discrepancies between crack and cocaine, is called the Len Bias law. And so you don't really need to do much work to realize, kind of the direct connection here. Adam, you do it beautifully in the piece. There's some really wonderful writing from you in the piece. I encourage people to go listen to it. But can you just paint a picture generationally from then to now what you see as the sweeping effect of this omnibus drug bill?
It's to compare it to a bomb detonating actually underplays it. It puts these harsh mandatory sentences, takes basically sentencing out of the hands of the common sense judges that are out there. And as was mentioned before, it creates disproportionate mandatory sentencing terms for crack cocaine. And basically what the bill ends up being is a way to imprison a whole generation of African Americans. And what you see is an explosion in the United States of the prison industrial complex, to the point where today the U.S. has more people in prison than any other country, not even per capita. In just raw numbers, we have 2 million people in prison in this country. And that's not even getting into people that are in the system that have it on their record. So it decimates communities. It decimates families. It rips fathers away from children. It also creates a level of trauma that fuels a cycle of pain and violence. It's a seismic event in recent U.S. history. I mean, wouldn't you agree, Jody? It's amazing what the damage that was done off this.
Well, and I started by asking you about Len Bias as a what if, and I think what this law ended up creating is just a generation of what if. The next Len Bias may have gotten caught up in a mandatory sentence for dealing a gram of crack, or the next great artist or musician, or just a father or a husband. It's just an entire generation of what ifs and lost opportunities.
And we should talk about how difficult it is to unwind this legislation. In 2010, the Fair Sentencing Act is passed, and it only drops the crack cocaine disparity down to 18-1. It doesn't even make them equivalents. And Barack Obama, towards the end of his term, really worked on commutation and clemency of people who were sentenced under these really harsh sentencing laws for nonviolent drug crimes. And he was able to do a lot. Like, there were a lot of people who had their sentences commuted or were granted clemency, but there are millions more whose lives were affected who haven't had any sort of restitution. So this is a generational problem, but it's a multi-generational problem that has been very, very difficult to address through politics.
Especially people who are locked up for marijuana, and it's become legal in so many states across the country. There needs to be restorative justice for them too.
Adam, final thought here?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Nicole, about how complicated it is. It's funny, and I know it's the show that everyone mentions when you talk about the supposed war on drugs, but I'm rewatching The Wire right now. I hadn't seen it since it came out. And it's just striking, it really, beyond even the war on drugs, how much it reads like a roadmap for how America went wrong. You see the collision of just shameless careerism, juking the stats, racism, income inequality. I mean, it's all in there, and it's so complicated. Yet the answers in some way are simple, which is just start doing the right thing one step after another, which hopefully we'll get on that path.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Adam McKay, thank you so much for doing this, and congratulations again on making a great series of Death at the Wing.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
And Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts, and we are, of course, in the middle of our spring fundraiser for Radiotopia. Thank you to everyone who has donated. For those of you waiting to become members, now is the time. Go ahead and become a recurring member and let us know, and we will let you see the big list of ideas that we use to put together this show each and every week. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. You can also find a forum at thisdaypod.com where you can find out lots more information about the show. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.